This video shortly describes the Freudian psychoanalytical theory of how the ego develops. This is an extremely difficult task for at least two main reasons. The first is that the conception of the ego changes considerably from the initial Freudian formulation in the Project for a Scientific Psychology to its final conceptualization in the second topography. The second reason is that the ego carries out an enormous amount of functions. These are difficult to summarize and range from being the seat of the consciousness and motility to deploying unconscious defenses against drives. When describing the functioning of psychic structures in Freudian theory, it is important to keep in mind what Freud called metapsychology, i.e., an approach that considers dynamic, topographical, and economic aspects of psychological phenomena. From an economic point of view, as was explained earlier, the ego performs the function of bonding psychic processes, which allow the development of the secondary process. From a topographical point of view, the ego is in a relationship of dependence on the drives that have their seat in the id, on the demands of reality, and on the imperatives of the superego, which, as will be described later, is a gradient of the ego. From the dynamic point of view, on the one hand, the ego represents the defensive pole and expresses itself through the unconscious defense mechanisms in the conflict of the personality. On the other hand, it represents the seat of perception consciousness and the system that allows access to voluntary motility, adaptation, flight from excessively intense stimuli, and memory. The defense mechanisms will be described in more detail in a later video. It is also possible to add a genetic point of view to the previous three. From this fourth perspective, Freud formulated three definitions of the ego that are hardly compatible with each other. To mention them briefly, the first considers the ego as an inhibitory structure, formed by a group of neurons which attract the incoming excitations, diverting them from their paths towards the discharge. The second definition describes the genesis of the ego as a differentiation of a structure which occurs on the basis of the sensations experienced in the perceptual pole, coming both from the external reality and from the surface of the body. The third considers the ego's character as the result of identifications with people we have lost or parted with in our lives. This in turn leads to the formation of the ego as an object of love cathected by the id. This mechanism was first illustrated by Freud in his work about Leonardo, and later used to explain how object cathexis are replaced by identifications in melancholia. Freud defined identification as a psychological process through which a subject assimilates aspects, properties, or attributes of another into which he is hence totally or partially transformed. An important issue regarding the ego's character and identity formation is the role assigned to the external reality. This does not seem to have been taken into account in Freud's first formulation, where the character is fundamentally shaped by the ego's defensive response to internal stimuli, namely drives requests. For example, the anal character is a result of the ego's defensive mechanisms in the face of the pressure exerted by the anal drives. It is typified by opposite character traits such as meticulousness, parsimony, and tidiness. The function of the ego's unconscious defenses is to prevent the onset of displeasure caused by the satisfaction of drive's demands. The organic primal repression sanctioned those demands as illicit and rejected them into the dynamic unconscious. Therefore, their satisfaction is felt as displeasure by the psychic apparatus. Another ego's conception, in which the external reality does not play a decisive role in its constitution, conceives the guidelines of the ego's character to be laid down before this psychic agency comes into existence. In this context, the ego is the result of the unfolding of an inheritedly transmitted program that encompasses all the lines of development, trends, and reactions that are later exhibited by an individual throughout life. If we use current terminology, this hypothesis defines the ego's character as the result of the unraveling of a constitutionally predetermined genetic program. In Freud's opinion, this would determine the peculiarities and attitudes of families, races, and nations. On the contrary, the third hypothesis on the constitution of the ego takes into account the external reality and other people. Freud wrote, "It is possible to suppose that the character of the ego is a precipitate of abandoned object cathexis and that it contains the history of those object choices." So let's start from the first statement mentioned earlier, that the ego is a group of neurons which retains a constant cathexis. As has been illustrated in the previous videos, Freud claims the ego is not present at birth and that it arises out of an undifferentiated ego matrix. Freud started from the fundamental proposition that, at the beginning of life, the newborn is basically a biological system capable of functioning automatically without the intervention of self-consciousness or an ego agency. He first described the ego as a group of neurons which retains a constant cathexis, thus constituting the vehicle for the store of quantity. We know that this quantity is energy borrowed from the id that is employed to carry out the functions of the secondary process. The ego is therefore an organization which interferes with the free passage of energetic quantities and inhibits psychical processes. This inhibitory function is explained by Freud through the mechanism of lateral cathexis. He wrote that if the contact barrier between two neurons, called neurons A and B, is facilitated, but an adjoining neuron, called alpha, is simultaneously cathected, the lateral cathexis of the neuron alpha acts as an inhibition on the passage of quantity from neuron A to neuron B. Freud's first description of the ego follows this idea of lateral cathexis. He wrote, "Let us imagine the ego as a network of cathected neurons, well facilitated in relation to one another. Then suppose a quantity enters neuron A from the outside. If it were uninfluenced, it would have proceeded to neuron B. But it is in fact so much influenced by the lateral cathexis in neuron alpha that it only passes on a quotient to B, or may not even reach B at all. Where then an ego exists, it is bound to inhibit psychical processes. Therefore, at the end of the 19th century, the ego for Freud was this network of cathected neurons ranging from alpha to delta, which were well facilitated with one another and adjacent to neuron A." The second statement, that the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. From his paper titled Introduction to Narcissism, Freud started to consider the ego as a sexual object. There he indicates that the ego is the result of a new psychic action, that is added to the existing autoerotism. By the term autoerotism, Freud meant an early infantile sexual behavior by which a partial drive, namely a drive linked to the excitation of an erogenous zone, finds its satisfaction in the same zone. In the autoerotism, an exterior object is not needed to satisfy the partial drive. Neither a unified image of the body nor a first sketch of the ego is yet formed. So, the narcissism constitutes a unifying new action that links the subject to his body, insofar as the ego is sustained in it. As Freud wrote in The Ego and the Id, a person's own body, and above all its surface, is a place from which both external and internal perceptions may spring. The ego is first and foremost a bodily ego. It is not merely a surface entity, but is itself the projection of a surface. Therefore, there is a transition from the body which feels disorganized, fragmented, and underpinned by the logic of autoerotic partial satisfactions to the bodily ego. This bodily ego is cathected by sexual drives, constituted as the unified body of an image and underpinned by the logic of identification. This is me. Freud described 3 developmental stages that start from autoerotism and reach the final stage of object love after passing through narcissism. At first, he had clearly preserved the idea that the sexual drives, which until then were isolated, became united while taking the ego as their object in the passage from autoerotism to narcissism. However, later on, this distinction was blurred, especially in some texts in which Freud admits the existence, even during intrauterine life, of a state of primary narcissism from the beginning. Autoerotism was only then defined as the sexual activity of the narcissistic phase of the libidinal organization. The third statement. The character of the ego is a precipitate of abandoned object cathexis. According to this third Freudian idea, one's personality is constituted and differentiated through a series of identifications. In Mourning and Melancholia, which speaks of the grieving process, Freud described a type of identification which he defined narcissistic. This identification is a substitution for the cathexis of the lost object. In The Ego and the Id, he later specified that the narcissistic identification is a frequent and typical process that has an important function. It not only occurs in melancholia, but also contributes to forming the ego and what we call the character. We become the beings that we lost by appropriating some aspects that belong to them. Therefore, we are a precipitate of identifications, whose roots we establish in childhood and carry throughout our existence. As we will see in the next video, Freud uses this same identificatory mechanism for replacing the loss of the object cathexis to explain the origin of the superego.